Subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real words of the Stoics, not paraphrased, not softened. Marcus Aurelius kept coming back to one piece of advice whenever his own thinking felt cluttered: retreat into yourself. Not physically, he couldn't exactly leave the frontier or excuse himself from a war council, but into the part of his own mind that stayed quiet regardless of what was happening around it. He describes this inner space as more restful and less troubled than any villa, seaside retreat, or mountain view a person could travel to, on the grounds that a mind still churning will bring its own noise with it wherever the body happens to travel, while a settled mind carries its own quiet with it into a war tent just as easily as into a private garden. The retreat wasn't an escape from the chaos outside. It was a specific place inside his own thinking that the chaos wasn't actually permitted to enter if he kept it maintained. Part of how he maintained it was a technique for describing things stripped of the emotional or exaggerated language that normally surrounds them, so he could see what was actually in front of him rather than the inflated version his own mind, or someone else's rhetoric, had dressed it up as. A rich purple robe, in his own private notebook, gets described as sheep's wool dyed with the blood of a shellfish. A fine meal is meat, the corpse of a fish or a bird. Expensive wine is described as fermented grape juice. He isn't being cynical about luxury for its own sake, and he isn't recommending anyone actually give up wine or fine cloth. The exercise is a deliberate tool for cutting through the fog that surrounds anything a person is tempted to overvalue or panic about, restoring the plain, literal facts underneath the exaggerated language before deciding how much any of it actually deserves his attention or his alarm. Applied to genuine chaos rather than mere luxury, the same technique works on threats and crises, not just temptations. A rumor spreading through camp, stripped of the panic audible in everyone else's voice as they repeat it, is simply unverified information passed from one uncertain person to another, a fact worth checking calmly, not automatically a fact worth reacting to on the spot. A superior's anger, described plainly rather than felt directly, is a temporary agitation in another person's judgment, not an objective verdict on your own worth. The chaos doesn't disappear once described this way. What disappears is the extra layer of alarm that other people's reactions, and your own first impression, had added on top of the plain event, which is usually where most of the actual disorientation was coming from in the first place. Epictetus makes a related argument from the opposite direction, focused less on describing events accurately and more on separating events from judgment about them at the source. He tells his students directly that it isn't events themselves that disturb a person, but the opinions they form about those events. The same external chaos can leave one person paralyzed and another person functioning normally, which tells you the chaos alone wasn't sufficient to produce either reaction on its own. Something added afterward, inside the mind of the person experiencing it, did most of the actual work of disturbing them. Chaotic circumstances, in his account, are simply raw material. What determines whether a person can think clearly through them is which judgments get attached to that raw material in the first few seconds after it arrives. There's a related discipline both men return to, which is refusing to think several steps ahead of the actual present moment during a crisis. Marcus repeatedly narrows his own attention back to the specific task directly in front of him, the letter that needs answering, the decision that needs making right now, rather than the entire unresolved future stretching out beyond it, which is usually where the real sense of being overwhelmed comes from. A person facing one decision at a time, however difficult that single decision is rarely as paralyzed as a person trying to simultaneously hold the entire uncertain future in mind while also trying to act in the present moment. Narrowing the frame back down to what's actually in front of you, deliberately and repeatedly, turns out to be most of what clear thinking under pressure actually consists of, more than any single clever technique applied once and expected to hold. Seneca adds a practical detail the other two mostly leave out: the physical conditions that make clear thinking harder or easier, independent of any mental technique layered on top of them. He warns Lucilius against making significant decisions in the middle of strong emotion at all, arguing that anger in particular distorts perception so thoroughly that a person under its influence isn't actually seeing the situation they think they're responding to, they're seeing a version of it inflated by the emotion itself, and any decision made from inside that distortion inherits the distortion along with it. His advice is almost procedural rather than philosophical: delay the decision, if delay is available, until the emotional weather has passed, and treat any judgment formed during the peak of a strong feeling as provisional rather than final, no matter how certain it feels in the moment it's formed. He illustrates this with anger specifically, describing it as a kind of temporary madness that convinces the angry person their distorted view is in fact the clearest, most honest view they've ever had, which is exactly the trap, since the conviction of clarity is itself a symptom of the distortion rather than evidence against it. Someone in the grip of chaotic circumstances, similarly convinced their panicked read of the situation is simply accurate reporting, is often making the identical mistake Seneca describes in his Angry Man, mistaking the intensity of a feeling for the reliability of a judgment, when the two have never actually been the same thing. None of this promises that the chaos itself resolves any faster because you've described it plainly or narrowed your attention, or waited out the emotional weather before deciding anything. The war Marcus was fighting from his tent didn't end because his notebook entries were composed and clear-headed. What changed was his own capacity to keep making sound decisions inside a situation that wasn't going to simplify itself on his behalf, which was the only part of the chaos that was ever actually his to influence in the first place. Clear thinking, in this account, isn't a feeling of calm. It's a discipline, stripping language back to plain fact, separating judgment from event, narrowing attention to the present task, and distrusting conclusions reached at the peak of a strong feeling, applied consistently enough that it holds up even when almost nothing else around it does. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the Stoics they trained, straight from the source, twice a day.